Case 1. Hassani Campbell. Our first story takes us to the Bay Area of California, to the city of Oakland, and to a 5-year-old boy named Hassani Campbell, a boy who lived with a physical disability that made his disappearance seem, from the very beginning, almost impossible to explain. Hassani was born on September 24, 2003, to a mother named Shamika Campbell, who struggled for years with substance abuse and health problems that made it impossible for her to care for her son. Hassani had cerebral palsy, a condition that affects a person's muscle control and movement, and because of this condition, he could not run or jump, and he needed leg braces just to walk on his own. Cerebral palsy is a condition that develops before or during birth, affecting the parts of the brain that control movement and coordination. For a child like Hassani, this meant that everyday physical tasks that come naturally to most children, walking across a room, climbing stairs, running to catch up with a friend, required real effort and, in his case, mechanical support in the form of leg braces. This detail would end up sitting at the very center of the entire mystery surrounding his disappearance, because it made the official explanation given by his caregivers so difficult for investigators to accept at face value. Because his mother could not provide for him, Hassani and his younger sister, Aaliyah, who was only 1 year old, went to live with their aunt, a woman named Jennifer Campbell, and her fiancé, a man named Louis Ross, in December of 2008. The couple was in the process of legally adopting Hassani, and according to state child welfare records at the time, they were doing a good job, conscientiously handling his medical needs and appointments. But behind the scenes, the relationship between Jennifer and Louis was troubled. There had been incidents of domestic violence between the couple, and just weeks before Hassani disappeared, Louis had sent Jennifer a text message in a fit of anger, threatening to leave Hassani alone on a train platform. Louis later said he never meant it and never planned to follow through, but the message would take on much darker meaning after what happened next. On August 10, 2009, Louis Ross was driving Hassani and his baby sister Aaliyah to meet Jennifer at the shoe store where she worked as a manager, a store called Shoes, located on College Avenue in the Rockridge area of Oakland. According to Louis, he parked his car in the back parking lot of the store at around 4:15 in the afternoon. He said he left Hassani standing outside the car while he carried Aaliyah inside to unlock the store's door. When he returned to the car just moments later, Louis said Hassani was gone. At the time, Hassani weighed only about 40 pounds and stood roughly 3 feet tall, wearing leg braces that made his walk slow and effortful. Details that would become central to how investigators, and later, the public, understood just how strange his disappearance truly was. The backlot behind the shoe store where he was last seen was, according to later reporting, only a short distance from the busy commercial strip of College Avenue, an area with a steady flow of pedestrian and vehicle traffic throughout the late afternoon. Rockridge is one of Oakland's more upscale and heavily trafficked neighborhoods, known for its shops, cafes, and steady stream of pedestrians throughout the day, which made the complete absence of any witnesses all the more perplexing to investigators working the case. A child struggling to walk on his own, wearing visible leg braces, moving away from a parked vehicle in broad daylight during a busy commercial hour, should have been the kind of sight that at least one passerby would remember. That nobody did remember seeing him left detectives with very few natural leads to pursue beyond the family itself. Louis and Jennifer called the police immediately, and a search began right away throughout the neighborhood. But because of Hassani's cerebral palsy, investigators knew right away that this case did not add up the way a typical missing child case might. Hassani could not run. He could not move quickly at all. He could barely walk without help, even with his leg braces on. For him to have simply wandered off in the few moments Louis was inside the store seemed almost physically impossible. especially without anyone in the busy area noticing a small boy struggling to walk away on his own. Jennifer Campbell, Hassani's aunt, had stepped into the role of primary caregiver for her nephew and niece, at a time when few other family members were in a position to take on that responsibility, given their biological mother's ongoing struggles. Family members later described Jennifer as someone who had genuinely wanted to give Hassani and Aaliyah a stable home, even as her relationship with Louis remained troubled beneath the surface. This complicated picture, a caregiver who appeared devoted to a child's medical needs on paper, paired with a household affected by documented domestic conflict, became one of the defining tensions investigators wrestled with throughout the entire case. Investigators spent considerable time examining the relationship between Louis and Jennifer in the weeks and months leading up to Hassani's disappearance, uncovering a pattern of documented domestic violence incidents between the couple that had never resulted in any involvement from Child Protective Services regarding Hassani's safety specifically. Louis had also, on a prior occasion, left the two children alone in the home while running an errand to the bank, a detail that, while not illegal on its own, contributed to investigators' broader sense that the household environment may not have been as stable as state caseworkers had believed when approving the couple as prospective adoptive parents. As investigators dug deeper, more troubling details came to light. Louis Ross was given a polygraph test, commonly known as a lie detector test, and he failed it. Jennifer Campbell refused to take a polygraph test herself, saying she was pregnant at the time and worried the stress of the test might harm her unborn baby. A failed polygraph test does not amount to proof of guilt in a court of law, and results from these tests are generally not even admissible as evidence at trial, but for investigators working a missing child case, a failed test still carries significant weight in shaping where they focus their attention and resources. Combined with Jennifer's refusal to take the same test, even with her stated medical reasoning, the results left detectives with a strong sense that something about the couple's account of that August afternoon did not add up, even without enough hard evidence to move forward with any arrest. Police searched the couple's home in Fremont and impounded Louis' car, a 2002 BMW, hoping to find some piece of physical evidence that might explain what had truly happened to the little boy. Despite an extensive search of the neighborhood, involving door-to-door searches and volunteers combing nearby parks and open spaces, no trace of Hassani was ever found. Sniffer dogs were brought in to try to track his scent, but even they came up empty. The Rockridge neighborhood where Hassani vanished is a busy, walkable commercial district lined with shops, restaurants, and a steady flow of foot traffic throughout the afternoon and evening, which made the case even more puzzling to investigators. In a typical missing child case involving a busy public area like this one, detectives would expect witnesses, people walking past who might have noticed a small child alone, or someone struggling to help him, or a car pulling away unusually fast. In Hassani's case, virtually nobody in that busy area recalled seeing him at all. A detail that Oakland police found deeply troubling given how quickly and completely he seemed to have vanished from a spot that should have had dozens of potential witnesses nearby. In the days following his disappearance, the Oakland Police Department received an unusually small number of tips for a case of this size, something detectives noted publicly as strange, given how much media attention the case had already received. An Oakland police spokesperson told reporters at the time that this low volume of tips was itself unusual for a missing child case of this scale, since cases involving young children typically generate far more public response, especially once local and national media outlets begin covering the story closely. This detail, the near silence from the public despite widespread coverage, added another layer of unease to an investigation already full of unanswered questions about how a boy with such limited mobility could have vanished so completely from a busy commercial district without a single confirmed witness coming. Forward. Before his disappearance, Hassani had been attending James Leach Elementary School in Fremont, where teachers and staff had grown familiar with his condition and his needs, working with his foster parents to accommodate his medical appointments and physical therapy sessions. People who knew him described a boy who, despite the physical challenges he faced every day, had a warm and easygoing personality. Someone who did not let his condition stop him from engaging with the people and the world around him. This made his sudden and complete disappearance all the more jarring to those who knew him. A child whose physical limitations were so well known to everyone around him that the idea of him simply walking away unnoticed seemed almost impossible to accept. Louis Ross continued for years afterward to insist that he had told police the truth, appearing in television interviews and pleading for the public's help finding his foster son, even as investigators continued to view him and Jennifer with deep suspicion. He said in one interview that Hassani did not wander away, emphasizing that his disability made that kind of behavior essentially impossible. Following Hassani's disappearance, his infant sister Aliyah was placed into protective custody by the state, removed from Jennifer and Louis's care entirely as investigators worked to determine what had truly happened. This decision by child welfare officials reflected just how seriously authorities had come to doubt the couple's version of events, even without enough evidence at that point to bring any criminal charges forward. Aliyah's removal from the household meant that, unlike Jesse's older siblings in a later case in this documentary, she was never able to provide investigators with first-hand testimony about what had truly happened, given that she was far too young at the time to have any usable memory of that August afternoon or the months before it. This left investigators without one of the potentially valuable sources of information that proved so critical in resolving other cases discussed throughout this documentary, another factor that has likely contributed to the case remaining unsolved for so many years. Neither Louis nor Jennifer has ever been arrested or formally charged with any crime connected to Hassani's disappearance, despite investigators' long-standing doubts about the story they were told that August afternoon. As the years passed, Hassani's case remained active but unsolved. The Polly Klaas Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping find missing children, has continued to feature his case prominently, releasing updated age progression photographs showing what Hassani might look like as he grew older, first as a young boy and more recently in his early 20s. A $10,000 reward was offered early on by Oakland police and Crime Stoppers for information leading to his whereabouts, a reward that, even after more than 15 years, has never been claimed. His case was also featured on a popular true crime podcast, bringing renewed national attention to a boy many feel has been forgotten by all but those who loved him and those still working to solve his case. Renewed media coverage, including a report published by a Bay Area television station on the 15th anniversary of his disappearance, has continued to keep his photograph and his story circulating publicly, in the hope that someone, somewhere, might finally recognize him or come forward with the missing piece of information that could finally bring his case to a close. As of today, Hassani Campbell has never been found. He would be in his 20s now. His biological mother, Shamika Campbell, who was never considered a person of interest in the case given her limited contact with him in the years before his disappearance, has said in past interviews that she still holds on to hope that her son is alive somewhere, even as she has had to reconcile that hope with the passage of so many years without any answers. Hassani's case gained renewed national attention when it was featured, alongside another missing persons case, in an episode of the popular podcast Crime Junkie titled to specifically call for justice on his behalf. This kind of renewed media coverage, decades after a case first makes headlines, has become an increasingly important tool for keeping cold cases like Hassani's in the public eye, often generating fresh tips or renewed public pressure on agencies to revisit evidence with modern forensic techniques that may not have been available at the time of the original investigation. Advances in forensic DNA technology over the 15-plus years since Hassani vanished have transformed how cold case investigators approach cases like his, allowing crime labs to extract usable genetic profiles from evidence samples that would have been considered too degraded or too limited in quantity to test reliably back in 2009. Investigators working long-term missing persons cases regularly resubmit old evidence for retesting as forensic science continues to improve, a process that has led to breakthroughs in cold cases decades old across the country, offering families like Hassani's a form of ongoing hope even without any new physical leads currently pointing toward his whereabouts. The Oakland Police Department has periodically revisited the case file over the years, and it remains formally classified alongside a small number of other long unsolved missing child cases. The department continues to actively review whenever new information surfaces. Investigators with the Oakland Police Department have said the case remains open, and they continue to ask anyone with information from that August afternoon in 2009, no matter how small it might seem, to come forward in the hope that somewhere out there, someone still remembers what really happened to a 5-year-old boy who was simply left standing beside a car for a few short minutes and never seen again. Case 2. Jesse Shockley. Our next case takes us to Glendale, Arizona, a suburb of Phoenix, and to a 5-year-old girl named Jessie Shockley, a case that would end, years later, in a conviction, even though her body has still never been found. Jessie's early life was already marked by hardship. Her mother, Jeris Hunter, had a documented history of abuse toward her other children, including a conviction years earlier in California for torturing one of Jessie's older sisters and causing physical injuries to several of her other children. Because of this history, Jessie had spent part of her early childhood being raised primarily by a cousin, a woman named Lisa Vance, until she was around 4 years old, before eventually being returned to her mother's custody. Hunter's prior conviction in California had resulted in a prison sentence, after which she was eventually released and, over time, regained custody of her children, including Jessie, who had been born after that earlier period of abuse. The fact that a parent with a documented felony conviction for torturing a child could eventually regain custody of other children, including a newborn baby, speaks to the significant legal and practical challenges child welfare systems face in balancing a parent's right to reunification against the ongoing risk that parent may pose to children in their care, a tension that echoes throughout several of the cases explored in this documentary. Lisa Vance, who had cared for Jessie during those early years, would later describe the little girl as sweet and full of energy, and she never stopped believing something had gone terribly wrong once Jessie was returned to her mother's household. Court records from Hunter's earlier conviction in California painted a disturbing picture of a household where physical punishment regularly crossed the line into outright abuse, with several of Jessie's older siblings bearing the physical marks of that mistreatment years before Jessie herself was ever born. Despite this documented history from California, Arizona's own Child Protective Services had limited independent awareness of the extent of Hunter's past when Jessie was living under her roof in Glendale. Since criminal and child welfare records do not always transfer seamlessly between states, a gap that would later draw criticism from child advocates who argued that a more thorough background review might have flagged the family for closer monitoring long before Jessie ever disappeared. On October 11, 2011, Jeris Hunter called police and reported that Jessie had gone missing from their apartment near 43rd Avenue and Glendale Avenue. According to Hunter, she had left Jessie at home under the supervision of her 3 older siblings, who were 13, 9, and 6 years old at the time, while she went out to run an errand. When she returned, Hunter said, Jessie was gone, having apparently wandered out the front door sometime around 5 in the evening without anyone noticing. Hunter told police that Jessie had last been seen wearing a plain white t-shirt, blue denim shorts, and pink flip-flop sandals. Glendale police issued an immediate public appeal for information, and officers began canvassing the apartment complex and surrounding neighborhood that same evening, hoping to find the little girl before nightfall. As with several other cases in this documentary, that first night passed without any sign of her, and as the following days brought no new leads, official concern for Jessie's safety only continued to grow. Neighbors in the apartment complex where the family lived told reporters in the days after Jessie's disappearance that they had rarely, if ever, seen the little girl outside playing with other children in the community, a detail that, taken together with her documented school absences, painted an increasingly troubling picture of a child who seemed to have been kept largely isolated from the outside world in the final weeks and months of her life. This kind of isolation, a child who essentially disappears from public view well before an official missing persons report is ever filed, would later be recognized by investigators as one of the clearest warning signs in the entire case, a pattern that, in hindsight, should have prompted closer attention from someone, anyone, in a position to check on her well-being sooner. Almost immediately, police found problems with this story. They learned that Jessie had been absent from school for days and even weeks at a time in the 2 months leading up to her disappearance, raising the question of why nobody, not the school, and not any family member, had raised concerns earlier. This pattern of unexplained school absences preceding a child's disappearance appears again and again throughout the cases in this documentary, and it stands as one of the clearest warning signs that something in a child's home life may have already gone terribly wrong long before anyone ever files an official missing person report. In Jessie's case, those weeks of absence would later become a critical piece of the prosecution's timeline, helping investigators establish that she had likely already died well before her mother ever called police to report her missing. When investigators interviewed Jessie's older sister, the girl told them something that would change the entire direction of the case. She said that she remembered seeing Jessie locked inside a closet in the family's apartment, where she appeared bruised, malnourished, and unresponsive. The sister described her look using words that stunned investigators, saying Jessie looked like what she called a zombie, and that the closet she was kept in looked like what the girl described as a grave. The sister also said that Hunter had instructed the children to lie to police about what had really been happening in their home. In November of 2011, just over a month after Jessie was reported missing, police arrested Jerris Hunter on child abuse charges directly related to her daughter. At the time, police stated publicly that they did not believe they would find Jessie alive, and that Hunter was, in their words, their number one focus in the investigation. However, without enough hard evidence at that point to bring the case to trial, prosecutors were forced to release Hunter, and she remained free for many more months while the investigation continued. During this period, detectives and forensic investigators kept working the case quietly behind the scenes, continuing to interview witnesses and family members, and gathering the pieces of evidence that would eventually form the foundation of the murder case against Hunter. The nearly year-long gap between Hunter's first arrest and her formal indictment on murder charges reflected just how difficult it can be to build a legally solid case against a parent in a situation where the child's own body has never been recovered, requiring prosecutors to rely instead on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and a timeline pieced together from school attendance records and statements from Jessie's own siblings. Detectives came to believe that Jessie had not disappeared on October 11th at all, but had actually died days or even weeks earlier, and that her mother had disposed of her body before ever reporting her missing, using the wandering off story as a cover. This theory, that a mother would report a fabricated disappearance days or weeks after her child had actually died, in order to create a plausible cover story is a pattern investigators have unfortunately seen before in cases involving parental abuse resulting in death, and it would go on to shape the entire direction of the prosecution's case. Establishing this timeline required painstaking work from investigators, piecing together the last confirmed sightings of Jessie, her documented school absences, and eventually the testimony of her own siblings to build a picture of when she most likely actually died, a picture that differed significantly from the account her mother had originally given police. Acting on information gathered during the investigation, police came to believe Jessie's body had been placed in a dumpster in nearby Tempe, Arizona, and from there, hauled away along with ordinary household trash to a landfill called Butterfield Station, located in the small community of Mobile, south of Phoenix. What followed was one of the largest and most painstaking searches ever conducted for a missing child's remains. Beginning in February of 2012, 280 officers from Glendale Police and surrounding departments spent 96 days, nearly 4 full months, manually sifting through approximately 9,500 tons of garbage at the landfill, searching for any trace of the little girl. The scale of this search is difficult to put into perspective without understanding what a landfill of that size actually involves. Officers worked in protective gear for months, going through layer after layer of compacted household trash by hand and with specialized machinery, all while trying not to destroy or overlook the very evidence they were searching for. It stands as one of the most extensive searches of its kind ever undertaken by an American police department for a single missing child's remains, a testament to how seriously Glendale investigators took the case even without a body to guide their broader theory. Officers rotated through the search in organized shifts, working in coordination with landfill operators to methodically sort through incoming and previously deposited waste layer by layer, in an operation that required specialized safety training, given the hazards involved in searching through so much decomposing material for months at a time. The financial and logistical cost of maintaining a search operation of this scale for 96 consecutive days was itself extraordinary, reflecting a level of institutional commitment that few other missing child cases in American history have received. Despite this massive and painstaking effort, no remains were ever found, and in June of 2012, the search was called off. Glendale's police chief said publicly at the time that she believed Jessie's final resting place was likely somewhere at the bottom of that landfill, even though the search itself had come up empty. On September 6, 2012, nearly 11 months after Jessie was first reported missing, a Maricopa County grand jury indicted Jerris Hunter on charges of first-degree murder and child abuse, and she was arrested a second time. Her attorney argued at the time that prosecuting a murder case without a body was extremely difficult, but the Maricopa County Attorney's Office noted that its prosecutors had successfully secured convictions in similar cases before, even without a victim's remains ever being recovered. Glendale's interim police chief at the time, Deborah Black, spoke at a press conference announcing the indictment, telling reporters that her department's investigators, working in cooperation with the FBI and the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, had worked tirelessly over nearly a full year to accomplish two goals: finding Jessie and holding whoever was responsible for her disappearance accountable. She said the indictment represented the achievement of that second goal, even though the first, actually locating the little girl, remained unfulfilled. The trial finally took place in April of 2015, more than 3 years after Jessie vanished. Prosecutors argued that Hunter had kept her daughter locked away at their home, depriving her of food and water until she eventually died from the abuse and neglect. The jury agreed, convicting Hunter of both first-degree murder and child abuse, and determining that several aggravating factors had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt regarding the abuse charge, factors that would ultimately push her sentence toward the maximum possible punishment. Hunter showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read in court, while her own mother, sitting in the gallery, broke down crying and had to be escorted from the courtroom by security. In June of 2015, Jerris Hunter was sentenced to spend the rest of her natural life in prison for the murder charge, along with an additional consecutive 20-year sentence for the child abuse conviction. Even at her sentencing, and in the years since, Hunter has continued to maintain her innocence, with her attorney arguing during the trial that Jessie might not even be dead at all, and that Hunter herself still believes her daughter could somehow still be alive. In the years following the conviction, Jessie's extended family filed a $10 million wrongful death lawsuit against the state of Arizona, Glendale Police, and Arizona's Child Protective Services Agency, alleging that these agencies had been grossly negligent in returning Jessie to her mother's custody in the first place. Despite Hunter's documented history of abuse, and further alleging that complaints about ongoing abuse in the months before Jessie's disappearance had been ignored. The lawsuit highlighted a pattern that echoes through several of the cases discussed in this documentary. A child returned to or left in the care of a parent with a well-documented history of abuse, followed by a tragedy that advocates argue could have been prevented had the warning signs been taken more seriously by the very agencies responsible for a child's protection. Jessie's cousin, Lisa Vance, who had raised the girl for several years before she was returned to her mother, told reporters after Hunter's conviction that she had always believed her cousin was responsible, and that receiving the guilty verdict finally validated years of fear and suspicion she had carried since Jessie's disappearance. Jessie's 3 older siblings, who were still living in the home at the time of her disappearance and whose testimony ultimately proved so critical to the case against their mother, were placed into protective care once the extent of the abuse in the household became clear to investigators. The bravery of Jessie's older sister in describing what she had witnessed, despite having been told by her own mother to lie about it, stands as one of the most pivotal moments in the entire case, providing investigators with the crucial first-hand account that helped transform a missing persons case into a murder prosecution. Child welfare experts who have studied cases involving sibling testimony describe just how difficult it can be for a child to come forward against their own parent, especially when that child has already been coached, threatened, or manipulated into staying silent, as Jessie's siblings reportedly were. The fact that the truth still managed to surface through the courage of a child who was herself a victim of the same household's abuse stands as one of the few pieces of this otherwise devastating case that offers something resembling hope, a reminder that even children who have been taught to keep secrets can sometimes find the strength to tell the truth when someone finally asks the right questions. Jessie's older siblings have largely stayed out of the public spotlight in the years since the trial concluded, and their identities have generally been protected in ongoing media coverage of the case, out of respect for their privacy, and given that they were minors themselves at the time of the events they had to testify about. As of today, Jessie Shockley's body has never been recovered, despite one of the largest landfill searches in American law enforcement history. Her case stands as one of the rare examples on this list where a conviction was ultimately secured without a body ever being found, giving her family at least a measure of the justice they had fought for, even though the little girl herself has never been brought home. Coons Jr. Our next case takes us into the wilderness of eastern Idaho, to a remote campground where a 2-year-old boy vanished in the middle of the day, surrounded by 4 adults, none of whom have ever been able to fully explain what happened. Dior Coons Jr. lived in Idaho Falls with his parents, Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Dior Coons Sr. In early July of 2015, the young family decided on a last-minute camping trip to a remote spot called Timber Creek Campground, located in Lemhi County, deep within the Salmon Chalice National Forest, roughly 2 hours from their home near a small town called Lador. They were joined on the trip by Dior's great-grandfather, a man named Robert Walton, and Walton's friend, a man named Isaac Reinwand, who had never actually met Dior or his parents before that trip. Other family members later described the trip as something the young couple decided on somewhat suddenly and unexpectedly, a spur-of-the-moment getaway rather than a carefully planned family vacation, a detail that would later feed into public speculation about how well prepared the group truly was to safely watch over a 2-year-old boy in such a remote wilderness setting. The group arrived at the campground on the evening of July 9th, set up their campsite together, built a campfire, and settled in for the night, with Dior helping his parents as they got everything ready. The following morning, the group spent time relaxing around the campground, sitting near a nearby waterway called Timber Creek, which ran alongside the site, close to a body of water called Stone Reservoir. Then, sometime on the afternoon of July 10th, at around 2:40, the small group split up. What followed became the central and most disputed mystery of the entire case. Jessica and Vernal later said they believed Dior's great-grandfather, Robert Walton, was watching the toddler back at the campsite, while Walton, for his part, said he believed the boy was down by the creek with his parents and with Isaac Reinwand. In other words, every single adult present that day believed someone else was watching Dior, and in that gap, in that few minutes when everyone assumed somebody else had their eyes on the boy, he disappeared. This kind of diffusion of responsibility, where a group of adults each individually assumes someone else is watching a child, is a recognized phenomenon that child safety experts have pointed to in explaining how even attentive, loving family gatherings can sometimes result in a young child briefly going unsupervised. What makes Dior's case so unusual and so difficult for investigators to resolve is that this brief gap in supervision, likely lasting only a few minutes at most, resulted in a child vanishing so completely and so permanently in an area remote enough that even the most basic explanations, that he wandered into the creek or into the surrounding woods, have never been confirmed by any physical evidence at all, despite years of searching. When the group realized Dior was missing, panic set in immediately. They searched the immediate area around the campsite and the creek, and then, when they could not find him, they drove 40 minutes down the highway to a small convenience store in Leador called the Stage Shop, where they told investigators later that a store clerk had seen them there with Dior, though this detail would later become one of many points of confusion and dispute in the case, since the very location and timeline offered by the family shifted at different points during the investigation. This detour to the convenience store, rather than an immediate call to law enforcement from the campsite itself, became one of the more scrutinized decisions of that entire afternoon. Investigators have never been able to fully verify or discredit the family's claim that a store clerk witnessed Mitchell and Kuntz with Dior there, since the specifics of that account shifted across different retellings, leaving open the question of whether the family was genuinely searching for cell phone service to call for help, or whether the stop served some other purpose entirely. Search and rescue teams descended on the remote campground almost immediately, and what followed became one of the largest search efforts in Idaho history for a missing child. Crews searched on foot, on horseback, and using all-terrain vehicles. Helicopters and later drones scoured the skies above the dense forest and the reservoir. Specially trained search dogs were brought in to try to pick up any scent that might lead investigators to the boy. Timber Creek Campground itself is part of what makes this case so uniquely difficult. The area sits deep within the Salmon Chalice National Forest, one of the largest and most rugged stretches of wilderness in the entire country, filled with dense timber, steep terrain, fast-moving water, and few, if any, cell phone signals for miles in any direction. Search coordinators noted early on that the sheer remoteness and difficulty of the terrain made even a routine search painstakingly slow, let alone one searching for a 2-year-old boy who, if he had simply wandered off on his own, would have had almost no ability to survive for long in that kind of environment. Divers were brought in specifically to search both Timber Creek itself and the nearby Stone Reservoir, given the proximity of both bodies of water to the campsite where Dior was last seen. These water searches, conducted using specialized underwater equipment and diving teams trained for exactly this kind of search, were repeated multiple times over the following years, as investigators and later private investigators continued to consider the creek and reservoir among the most likely locations where physical evidence, if it existed at all, might eventually be found. None of these repeated water searches ever turned up anything connected to the case. Despite all of this effort, across dozens of searches conducted over the following decade, absolutely no physical trace of Dior Kunz Jr. has ever been found. The case drew significant national media attention in its early weeks, with the parents giving a joint interview to reporters just days after Dior vanished, appearing visibly distressed as they pleaded for help finding their son. That early interview would later be picked apart repeatedly by both professional investigators and amateur online sleuths who scrutinized the parents' body language, word choices, and emotional responses for any sign of what might have really happened, a level of public scrutiny that both Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz have said made an already unbearable situation even harder to endure. As investigators pieced together the timeline of that day, they noticed troubling inconsistencies in the accounts given by Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz. Initially, both parents described leaving Dior with his great-grandfather for only a few minutes, but as detectives pressed for more specific details, their stories began to shift, with small but significant discrepancies emerging about who had been where, and when, and for how long. Investigators have noted that in cases involving multiple adults present at the scene of a child's disappearance, this kind of gradual shifting in individual accounts, small details changing slightly with each retelling, is not automatically evidence of wrongdoing, since memory itself can be unreliable, especially under the stress and trauma of a missing child investigation. However, in Dior's case, the sheer number of these small inconsistencies, layered across multiple witnesses and multiple interviews conducted over the following months, ultimately convinced Lemhi County investigators that something more than simple memory error was likely at play. These inconsistencies led investigators to grow increasingly suspicious that the adults present that day, particularly Dior's own parents, might be hiding something about what had truly happened to him. In January of 2016, roughly 6 months after Dior vanished, the Lemhi County Sheriff at the time, a man named Lynn Bowerman, publicly named both Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz as suspects in the case. The public naming of suspects in a missing child case, without any accompanying arrest or charge, put the young couple in an extraordinarily difficult position, forced to live under a cloud of public suspicion for years while never having the opportunity to formally clear their names in a court of law. Dior's father, Vernal Kunz, eventually left Idaho Falls entirely, according to his attorney, Alan Browning, who has said publicly that his client endured constant, non-stop hostility from the public over the years, ultimately making it impossible for him to continue living in the community where the disappearance had taken place. Browning has stated flatly that Kunz had absolutely nothing to do with his son's disappearance. Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz are no longer together as a couple, according to more recent reporting on the case. Despite this designation, neither parent has ever been arrested or formally charged with any crime connected to Dior's disappearance, and both have maintained from the very beginning that they do not know what happened to their son. Bowerman stated publicly, even years after leaving office, that he personally believed Dior was dead and that he continued to consider the boy's parents suspects in his death. Over the years, the case attracted the attention of multiple private investigators, each of whom developed their own theory about what had really happened at Timber Creek Campground. One investigator, a man named Philip Klein, spent months interviewing the parents, along with Walton and Reinwand, and ultimately concluded that Dior had been the victim of what he described as an accidental homicide, and that both Mitchell and Kunz were somehow involved in it. Another investigator, David Marshburn, developed an entirely different theory, concluding that Dior's parents likely had nothing to do with the disappearance, and instead believing that Isaac Reinwand, the friend who had never met the family before that camping trip, knew more than he had ever told investigators. Reinwand has always denied having anything to do with Dior's disappearance. In 2019, nearly 4 years after Dior vanished, Marshburn brought 2 specially trained cadaver dogs trained specifically to detect the scent of human remains, to search the campground once again. According to Marshburn, both dogs alerted on a specific area near the campsite, a development he described at the time as potentially the breakthrough the case had been waiting for. The involvement of multiple private investigators over the years, each pursuing their own theory and often disagreeing publicly with one another, became one of the more unusual features of this case, illustrating just how much public fascination and frustration had built up around the mystery. Family members and community volunteers turned to these outside investigators in part because official law enforcement resources had, by necessity, scaled back their active involvement in the years after the initial search, leaving a gap that these private investigators tried to fill, sometimes with genuinely useful new leads, and sometimes with theories that ultimately went nowhere. The current Lemhi County Sheriff's Office has continued to mark the anniversary of Dior's disappearance each year, returning to Timber Creek Campground for what has become an annual ritual search. Even a decade later, walking the same ground, checking the same waterways, in the hope that changing conditions, water levels, erosion, or simple chance might one day reveal something previous searches missed. Current investigators have said they remain willing to follow up on any credible new lead, no matter how small, understanding that in a case with this many unanswered questions, even the smallest new piece of information could potentially unlock everything else. Acting on this new information, authorities closed the Timber Creek Campground to the public for a weekend so a more thorough search of the area could be conducted. However, when the remains that were eventually recovered from the site were sent to the FBI for testing, the results came back negative for human DNA, another painful dead end in a case already full of them. Dior's family has continued to hold on to hope even as the years pass. His grandmother, Trina Clegg, has said publicly on multiple anniversaries of his disappearance that she still visits Timber Creek Campground, drawn back by what she describes as the sense of peace the remote area still gives her, a feeling that somehow keeps alive her hope that she will one day see her grandson again. Jessica Mitchell, Dior's mother, released a statement on the 10th anniversary of his disappearance in 2025, saying that every one of the more than 3,600 days since he vanished had felt the same, and that the pain of losing him remained every bit as real as it had been on the very first day. As of today, 10 years after Dior Kunz Jr. vanished from that remote Idaho campsite, nobody has ever been arrested, no charges have ever been filed, and the central mystery of the case remains exactly where it started. 4 adults, 1 small boy, and a gap of just a few minutes during which every single one of them assumed somebody else was watching him. Case 4. Summer Wells. Our next case takes us to the rolling hills of rural Hawkins County, Tennessee, to a small community called Beach Creek, and to a 5-year-old girl named Summer Wells, whose disappearance would go on to become one of the most extensively investigated missing child cases in the state's history. Summer lived with her parents, Don and Candace Wells, along with her brothers, in a home along Ben Hill Road, a remote stretch of the Appalachian countryside where houses sit far apart from one another, surrounded by hills, dense woods, and winding gravel roads. On the afternoon of June 15, 2021, Summer had been outside helping her mother and grandmother plant flowers in the yard. At some point, she asked to go inside, and her mother told her she could go play down in the basement. Summer was described by her family as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl who weighed about 40 pounds and stood roughly 3 feet tall, and who was possibly barefoot when she was last seen, having spent the afternoon playing and helping outside in the warm June weather. Candace went back to her gardening, and when she went to check on Summer a short while later, calling down to her more than once and getting no answer, she went downstairs to look and found that Summer was nowhere inside the house at all. She was simply gone. The basement of the Wells home had an exterior door that led directly outside toward the wooded hillside behind the property, a detail that became central to competing theories about what happened next. Family members have pointed to that door as a possible point of entry for anyone who might have approached the house from the woods, while investigators have never publicly confirmed finding any evidence, disturbed ground, forced entry, or otherwise, indicating the door was used by anyone other than Summer herself, if she indeed went through it at all. Summer was reported missing to the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office at approximately 6:30 that evening. An endangered child alert was issued almost immediately, and within about 12 hours, growing concern about Summer's safety led the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation to escalate the case further, issuing a full statewide Amber Alert, broadcasting Summer's photograph and description to cell phones and television screens all across Tennessee. That Amber Alert has never been cancelled and remains active to this day. The decision to escalate from a more limited endangered child alert to a full statewide Amber Alert reflected investigators' rapidly growing concern in those first crucial hours. Since Amber Alerts are typically reserved for cases where law enforcement has specific reason to believe a child has been abducted, rather than simply lost or wandered off nearby. The fact that this escalation happened within half a day of Summer's initial disappearance signaled early on just how seriously investigators were treating the case, even before any physical evidence pointing toward abduction had been found. In the days that followed, what officials would later describe as one of the most extensive missing child investigations in Tennessee history got underway. Search crews combed more than 3,000 acres of the surrounding countryside, using helicopters, small planes, drones, and scent tracking dogs, all in an effort to find some trace of the little girl. Dozens of agencies from multiple states joined the search, including teams from Ohio, Virginia, Georgia, and North Carolina. The terrain surrounding the Wells family home presented enormous challenges for search crews, much like the rugged countryside in several of the other cases on this list. Steep, wooded hillsides, thick underbrush, and a scattering of creeks and hollows meant that searchers had to move slowly and carefully across the land, often on foot, checking every possible hiding place or hazard a small child might have encountered. Investigators and volunteers returned to these same wooded areas again and again in the weeks and months that followed, expanding their search radius each time in hopes of finally finding some clue. Despite this massive effort, no physical trace of Summer was ever found. No clothing, no footprints, nothing that investigators could point to as evidence of what had happened to her after she was last seen heading toward that basement. Summer's parents, Don and Candace, have said from the very beginning that they believe their daughter was abducted. Don has described his belief that someone must have approached the property from the wooded hillside behind their home, possibly entering through the basement itself, or catching Summer as she stepped outside to play on a swing set in the yard. However, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has publicly and repeatedly stated that it has found no evidence supporting the theory that Summer was abducted from her family's home, while also declining to lay out any single alternative theory of what they believe actually happened to her. This gap between what the family believes and what investigators have been willing to say publicly has fueled years of speculation and debate among the public following the case, with true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators online forming their own competing theories, some more grounded, in fact, than others. The family's willingness to speak publicly and repeatedly to national media outlets, combined with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's comparatively guarded public statements, created a dynamic in which two very different narratives about the case circulated simultaneously for years, each competing for public attention and belief. In July of 2021, only weeks after Summer disappeared, Tennessee's Department of Children's Services removed Summer's brothers from the Wells family home, a significant and troubling development that raised further questions among those following the case closely, though officials have never fully explained the specific reasoning behind that decision to the public. This removal, occurring so soon after Summer's own disappearance, became one of the most closely scrutinized developments in the entire case, fueling intense public speculation about what state investigators might have observed or learned about conditions inside the Wells household that led them to act so quickly regarding the surviving children. Tennessee's Child Welfare Agency, citing confidentiality laws that protect the privacy of children in its care, has never released a detailed public explanation of its reasoning, leaving much of the public to draw their own conclusions from the timing alone. Don and Candace later signed over their parental rights to their surviving children, according to statements Don gave in later interviews, though the family has never fully clarified the circumstances surrounding that decision either. As the investigation continued, the case took on a life of its own on social media, with the disappearance drawing an enormous amount of public attention alongside a significant amount of misinformation, wild theories, and amateur online investigation that authorities have said, at times, actively interfered with their work. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office has issued public statements specifically addressing the spread of what they described as misinformation shared by online content creators and YouTubers, insisting that despite the noise online, their investigation into Summer's disappearance had never stopped and was being conducted every single day. The Wells family's own history added further complexity to how the public and investigators viewed the case. Don Wells had prior legal troubles, including a DUI arrest that came shortly after Summer's disappearance and later led to a probation violation that sent him to jail. He was later released and spoke publicly for the first time in early 2023, following his time in custody. The reward fund that had been established for information leading to Summer's whereabouts, which had grown to more than $40,000 through public donations, was eventually turned over in its entirety to a local child advocacy center after it became clear the fund could not fulfill its original purpose. Months after Summer went missing, Don and Candace appeared together on the Dr. Phil television program, where Don again stated publicly that he believed his daughter had been kidnapped, a national television appearance that brought Summer's case to an even wider audience across the country. Over the years since Summer's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation has continued to follow up on leads as they come in, including a specific lead investigated in November of 2025, more than 4 years after Summer went missing, when agents and detectives were seen at a location roughly 10 miles from the Wells family home. This pattern of periodic renewed activity, agents returning to new locations years after the original disappearance, tips being re-examined, and searches being quietly conducted, reflects how these long-running cold cases actually function behind the scenes, even during long stretches when there is no major news to report. Investigators have said publicly on multiple occasions that a case like Summer's is never truly closed simply because months or years pass without a public update, and that behind the scenes, dedicated resources continue to be assigned to reviewing new information as it comes in. Officials have not released details about what, if anything, that particular lead turned up, but they have used moments like this to reassure the public that Summer's case remains far from cold, with agents, along with the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office and the FBI, continuing to actively investigate what happened to her. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has released a series of updated age progression photographs over the years, showing what Summer might look like as she has grown, with the most recent images marking her 10th birthday. Age progression technology, which uses photographs of a missing child's biological relatives alongside specialized software to estimate how a child's face is likely to change as they grow older, has become an essential tool in long-term missing children cases across the country. These images are regularly updated as a child ages, and they are distributed widely through law enforcement channels, media outlets, and organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, in the hope that someone, somewhere, might recognize an older child or young adult whose appearance now more closely resembles the updated image than the original photograph taken at the time they disappeared. For Summer specifically, each new age progression release has become its own small moment of renewed public attention, prompting fresh rounds of media coverage and social media sharing that investigators hope might jog a memory or catch the eye of someone who has crossed paths with her without realizing who she might be. Summer's case has also become a touchstone example in broader conversations about the challenges facing rural missing child investigations, where the same isolated terrain that makes a community feel safe and quiet can also make a thorough search extraordinarily difficult, and where the absence of nearby security cameras or heavy foot traffic means investigators often have far fewer potential witnesses or evidence sources to draw from than they would in a more populated area. On the 5-year anniversary of Summer's disappearance, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released another public video appeal, a reminder that even after half a decade, the agency considers finding out what happened to her an active and ongoing priority. As of today, more than 5 years after Summer Wells disappeared from her family's basement on an ordinary June afternoon, she has never been found, and the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office continues to state publicly that her case has not been forgotten and, in their words, never will be until some form of closure is finally found. Case 5. Madalena Kojokari. Our next case takes us to Cornelius, North Carolina, a town just north of Charlotte, and to an 11-year-old 6th grader named Madalena Kojokari, whose disappearance would go unreported to police for nearly 3 full weeks after anyone outside her immediate family last saw her. Madalena was born in Moldova, a small country in Eastern Europe, and had come to live in the United States with her mother, Diana Kojokari, who was in the country on a green card. Diana was married to a man named Christopher Palmiter, who had become Madalena's stepfather. Madalena was described by neighbors and classmates as a quiet, sweet girl who loved horses and who had settled into life at Bailey Middle School as a 6th grader in her new country. Cornelius, the small town just north of Charlotte where the family lived, is the kind of quiet suburban community where a missing child case is almost unheard of, making the eventual news of Madalena's disappearance and the strange circumstances surrounding how long it took anyone to report her missing all the more shocking to her neighbors and the wider community once the story became public. At the time she was last seen, Madalena stood about 4 feet 10 inches tall and weighed around 90 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes, and was described as wearing jeans, pink, purple, and white sneakers, along with a white t-shirt and jacket. Police later noted that Madalena's own grandmother, in a separate interview, described a close relationship with her friend's family, though the friend's own relatives would later say Madalena's mother had, at times, asked for payment in exchange for allowing playdates between the girls, a small but strange detail that added another layer of unease to an already troubling picture of the family's home life. According to what investigators would later piece together, the last time Madalena was seen was the evening of November 23, 2022, when she went to her bedroom at around 10 at night, following an argument between her mother and Parmiter. Parmiter left the following day for a trip to Michigan, and according to court documents, he never saw Madalena again after he returned home. In the weeks that followed, Madalena's school, Bailey Middle School, grew increasingly concerned about her repeated and unexplained absences. Her school counselor left 5 separate voicemails and sent multiple emails directly to Parmiter, trying to find out why the 11-year-old girl had stopped coming to class. Most public school systems in North Carolina, like in many other states, have formal truancy escalation procedures meant to trigger increasingly serious intervention as a student's unexplained absences accumulate, often eventually involving a school resource officer or a formal report to local authorities if a parent or guardian remains unresponsive. In Madalena's case, the school's own outreach efforts, 5 voicemails and multiple emails over a period of weeks, appear to have stopped short of triggering that next level of formal escalation before the family finally came forward on their own in mid-December, a gap in the process that has drawn scrutiny from those examining how the case could have been caught sooner. According to a detective who later interviewed him, Parmiter acknowledged receiving every one of these messages, but told investigators he simply assumed his wife, Diana, was handling the situation, and he took no action himself to follow up or to report anything to authorities. This detail, a series of documented, ignored warnings from school staff over a period of weeks, became one of the most painful and widely discussed aspects of the entire case once it became public. It raised uncomfortable questions about how easily a child's prolonged absence from school can go unaddressed when the adults responsible for her simply choose not to act, and about what additional safeguards might be needed to ensure a child's safety is verified more directly when repeated red flags like this one begin to accumulate. News of Madalena's disappearance, once it finally broke publicly in mid-December of 2022, spread rapidly through the small, tight-knit community of Cornelius, a town where school events and neighborhood gatherings often bring families together, and where a missing child case of this nature had simply never happened before. Neighbors who had seen Madalena playing outside or riding the school bus in the weeks before her disappearance struggled to reconcile the ordinary, quiet life she seemed to be living with the deeply troubling circumstances that later emerged about the weeks leading up to it. It was not until December 15, 2022, more than 3 weeks after Madalena had last been seen, that her mother and stepfather finally reported her missing, telling school officials rather than police directly. This delay would become one of the most scrutinized and ultimately criminalized details of the entire case. North Carolina has a law, sometimes referred to as Kaylee's Law, named after another missing child case from Florida discussed elsewhere, that makes it a felony offense for a parent or guardian to fail to report a missing child to law enforcement within 24 hours of realizing the child cannot be located. Both Diana Kojakari and Christopher Parmiter were eventually arrested and charged under this exact law. Kaylee's Law, which exists in various forms across a number of American states, was created specifically to address situations exactly like this one, where a parent's failure to report a missing child in a timely manner can allow crucial early hours or days, the period when a search is most likely to succeed, to slip away entirely. North Carolina's version of the law reflects a broader nationwide effort in the years following high-profile cases of delayed reporting to close this particular gap, ensuring that adults responsible for a child's welfare cannot simply choose silence without facing legal consequences of their own, regardless of what may have actually happened to the missing child. Once police were finally notified, a large-scale search began, involving Cornelius Police, the FBI, and North Carolina's State Bureau of Investigation. Investigators searched the family's home and followed leads that took them from the Charlotte area all the way into the mountains of western North Carolina, but no trace of Madalena was ever found. The 3-week gap between Madalena's last confirmed sighting and the moment her disappearance was finally reported meant that by the time search teams began their work, any physical trail that might have existed had long since gone cold, a significant disadvantage compared to cases where searches begin within hours of a child going missing. Investigators have said publicly that this delay likely eliminated or degraded certain kinds of evidence, such as fresh security camera footage or witness memories that might otherwise have been available to them in the earliest and most critical days of a missing child investigation. Cornelius Police Chief David Baucom said publicly and directly that he believed Madalena's parents clearly knew more about what had happened to her than they had told investigators, a striking public statement from a police chief that underscored just how suspicious authorities had become of the couple's account. Baucom's willingness to speak so directly and publicly about his department's suspicions, rather than sticking to more cautious, carefully worded statements typical of ongoing investigations, reflected the frustration many in law enforcement felt as the case dragged on without a resolution. He has continued over the years to serve as one of the most consistent public voices connected to the case, periodically updating the community and reiterating that finding out what truly happened to Madalena remains a top priority for his department, even years after the initial search failed to turn up any physical evidence. In December of 2022, Diana Kojokari and Christopher Palmiter were formally arrested and charged with failure to report the disappearance of a child. Diana ultimately pleaded guilty to that charge before her husband's case ever went to trial. She was sentenced to a term of 6 to 17 months in prison, receiving credit for the time she had already spent in custody, and was released in May of 2024. Complicating the case even further, Diana Kojokari, a citizen of Moldova, later left the United States entirely and is believed to be living overseas today, in a country that does not have an extradition treaty with the United States, meaning that even though investigators consider her a suspect in Madalena's underlying disappearance, bringing her back to face any further questioning may prove extremely difficult. The lack of an extradition treaty between the United States and Moldova represents one of the most frustrating obstacles investigators face in this case, since it means that even if American prosecutors were eventually able to build a stronger case against Diana, specifically regarding Madalena's disappearance, actually compelling her return to face those charges could prove legally impossible. This detail has drawn criticism from advocates who argue it illustrates a broader challenge in cases involving international families, where a parent with dual national ties can potentially evade prosecution simply by returning to a home country that will not cooperate with American extradition requests. American diplomatic officials have occasionally pursued informal cooperation with foreign governments in similar cases, even absent a formal extradition treaty. Though such arrangements depend heavily on the specific relationship between the two countries involved and are never guaranteed, leaving Madalena's case, at least for now, in a kind of legal limbo where her mother remains a suspect that American authorities may never actually be able to bring back for questioning. Christopher Palmiter chose to fight his own charge at trial rather than plead guilty. During his week-long trial in the spring of 2024, his defense attorney argued that responsibility for the failure to report Madalena missing rested with Diana, not with him, since she was the girl's biological parent. The jury disagreed, and after deliberating for only about 15 minutes, found Palmiter guilty of failing to report the disappearance of a child. He was sentenced to a suspended term of 30 months of supervised probation rather than active prison time. Parmiter appealed his conviction, arguing, among other things, that the North Carolina reporting law was unconstitutionally vague and that it improperly forced him to incriminate himself. In May of 2026, the North Carolina Court of Appeals rejected every one of his arguments and upheld his conviction, ruling that there had been more than enough evidence for the original jury to conclude that Parmiter knew Madalena was missing in late 2022 and chose not to contact law enforcement despite that knowledge. The appeals court's ruling, coming more than 3 years after Madalena's initial disappearance, closed out one of the last remaining legal avenues available to Parmiter, meaning his conviction now stands as final unless he chooses to pursue an even more limited further appeal to North Carolina's Supreme Court. For a case that has produced so few definitive answers over the years, the conclusion of this particular legal chapter offered a small measure of certainty. Even as the central mystery of what actually happened to Madalena herself remains every bit as open today as it was the day her disappearance was first reported. Despite both convictions, neither Diana Kojokari nor Christopher Parmiter has ever been charged with any crime directly related to what actually happened to Madalena herself, meaning that even with 2 people held legally responsible for failing to report her missing, the central and most important question in the case, what actually happened to an 11-year-old girl after she went to her room on a November night in 2022, remains entirely unanswered. Investigators have continued to describe both her mother and her stepfather as persons of interest in her underlying disappearance, even without enough evidence at this point to bring any additional charges forward. As of today, more than 3 years after she was last seen getting off her school bus and heading into her family's home, Madalena Kojokari has never been found. Local media outlets in the Charlotte area have continued dedicated coverage of the case, including an ongoing series specifically devoted to tracking developments and following up with the community as the years pass, a reflection of just how deeply the case has affected the small town of Cornelius. Investigators have said they continue to follow up on tips as they come in, even years after the initial search, and Cornelius Police Chief David Baucom has remained one of the most consistent public voices on the case, periodically speaking to reporters to reassure the community that Madalena has not been forgotten by the department assigned to find her. Members of her community in Cornelius have continued holding vigils and awareness events on the anniversary of her disappearance, refusing to let her case fade from public memory, even as her mother remains overseas, seemingly beyond the reach of the investigators who still believe she holds answers nobody else can give. Case 6. Kyron Durnin. Our next case takes us across the Atlantic Ocean, to Ireland, and to a case so unusual that the head of Ireland's entire national police force would later say he had never seen anything quite like it in his 40 years of service. This is the story of a boy named Kyron Durnin, whose disappearance was not even reported to police until roughly 2 years after he had actually gone missing. Kyron lived with his mother, Dela Durnin, and his siblings at various points in the towns of Dundalk and Drogheda in County Louth in the Republic of Ireland, on Ireland's eastern coast, roughly midway between Dublin and the border with Northern Ireland. The family had moved between a number of addresses in the area in the years before Kieran disappeared, a pattern of instability that would later make it more difficult for investigators to reconstruct exactly where the family had been living and who might have had contact with Kyron during the critical period surrounding his disappearance. Kyron had been a pupil at St. Nicholas Monastery National School, a primary school located on Phillip Street in Dundalk, where he was described by those who knew him as a bright, smiling boy. He never finished out that school year after his mother reported him sick, and his file at the school was simply left open, awaiting a transfer that, as staff understood it, was already planned and simply had not yet been formally processed. Ireland's education system relies on schools to report prolonged, unexplained absences to TUSLA, the country's child and family agency, through a body known as the Educational Welfare Service, which is meant to follow up when a child's attendance drops below expected thresholds. In Kyron's case, because school staff believed a transfer to a different school across the border was already underway, that reporting mechanism was never triggered, since from the school's perspective, Kyron had not actually stopped attending school altogether. He had simply moved on to a different one. This particular breakdown, a reasonable but ultimately incorrect assumption on the part of school staff, has become one of the central case studies cited by those calling for reform in how school transfers are verified and tracked across the Irish education system. In late May of 2022, when Kyron was 6 years old, his mother contacted his school, telling staff that he was sick with COVID and would not be attending classes. Kyron never returned to that school again. However, staff at the school had also been told separately that the family was planning to move and that Kieran would likely be enrolling in a new school across the border in Northern Ireland the following school year. Because of this, when Kyron simply never returned in September, his continued absence did not raise any immediate alarm among school staff, who assumed the planned move had simply gone ahead as expected. For more than 2 years after that, nobody outside Kyron's immediate family appears to have questioned where he was or how he was doing. This 2-year gap stands as perhaps the most disturbing single detail in this entire documentary, a length of time during which a 6-year-old boy simply disappeared from any form of official record, from school rolls, from medical appointments, from any documented contact with the outside world, without triggering a single formal inquiry from any institution that might normally check on a child's welfare. It raises difficult questions about how many separate points of contact, school, healthcare, extended family, and government child welfare services would all need to fail simultaneously and repeatedly for a child to vanish so completely from view for so long. It was not until the end of August in 2024 that Kieran's grandmother, a woman named Rhonda Byrne Tyson, filed a missing person report at a Garda station in Drogheda, Ireland's police force being known as An Garda Síochána, or Gardaí for short. Tyson told police that her daughter Dela and 3 grandchildren, including Kieran, had stayed with her at her home on Han Street in Drogheda, but had left the following morning, and she said she was concerned about their well-being after losing contact with them. At first, police treated this simply as a missing persons case involving both Dela and Kieran together, issuing a public appeal in early September of 2024 with physical descriptions of both mother and son. Dela was eventually located safely in the United Kingdom. The discovery that Dela had been located without Kieran ever being with her marked the true turning point in the investigation, the moment when Gardaí realized this was not a simple case of a mother and son traveling together and losing contact with relatives, but something considerably more troubling. Investigators immediately began working backward through Dela's own movements and statements, trying to reconstruct exactly when she had last had Kieran in her care and what she had told others about his whereabouts during the 2 years in between. But Kieran was not with her, and investigators quickly discovered something deeply troubling as they began digging into the timeline. The very last confirmed images anyone had of Kieran had actually been taken back in June of 2022, more than 2 years earlier, meaning that whatever conversations, decisions, and movements had taken place in the family's life since that time, nobody had actually laid eyes on the boy himself in all that time. On October 16, 2024, Gardaí made a somber announcement. They stated that they now believed Kieran was missing, presumed dead, and that they were formally launching a murder investigation. This announcement came only about 7 weeks after the initial missing persons report had first been filed, an unusually fast escalation for Gardaí to move from treating a case as a routine missing persons matter to formally declaring it a murder investigation. The speed of this shift reflected just how quickly investigators had come to understand the true scope of the case once they began digging into the actual timeline of Kyron's disappearance, realizing within a matter of weeks that they were not looking at a recent missing child at all, but rather a boy who had likely been dead for well over 2 years by the time anyone reported him missing. Investigators said publicly that they believed Kyron had died at some point during the 2 years before his family ever reported him missing, and that whoever was responsible had gone to great lengths to conceal what had happened to him during all that time. What followed was one of the most intensive investigations in recent Irish criminal history. Gardaí searched multiple properties connected to the case, including the family's former home on Emma Terrace in Dundalk, which investigators took formal possession of under a search warrant in October of 2024. Detectives seized and reviewed an extraordinary volume of evidence, eventually gathering close to 30,000 hours of closed-circuit television footage from cameras throughout the area, hoping to piece together exactly what had happened to Kieran and when. Reviewing 30,000 hours of footage represents an enormous undertaking even for a well-resourced police force, requiring teams of analysts working for months, often using specialized software to help flag movement or specific individuals across such a massive volume of recorded material. The sheer scale of this review reflects just how seriously Gardaí treated the investigation from the moment it became a murder inquiry, working to reconstruct, frame by frame if necessary, a timeline stretching back more than 2 years in the hope of identifying the exact moment and circumstances of Kieran's death. Several individuals were arrested and questioned in connection with the investigation over the following months, though each was ultimately released without charge, a pattern that repeated itself multiple times as the case continued. This pattern of repeated arrests, followed by release without charge, reflects the genuine difficulty investigators have faced in building a case strong enough to bring to trial, even while remaining confident that Kyron's death was not accidental. Irish law, like most legal systems, requires prosecutors to meet a high evidentiary threshold before formal charges can be filed, particularly for a charge as serious as murder, and Gardaí have made clear through their continued investigative activity that they consider the case very much alive, even without a single arrest, yet resulting in formal prosecution. In December of 2024, a 36-year-old man named Anthony Maguire, who had previously been arrested and released in connection with the case, was found dead at his own home in Drogheda, a development that added yet another layer of tragedy and complexity to an already deeply troubling case. By August of 2025, marking almost exactly 1 year since Kyron was first reported missing, Gardaí renewed their public appeal for information, stating that Kyron, who would have turned 9 years old by then, remained missing, presumed dead, and that investigators believed he may have died as much as 3 years earlier. By that point, Gardaí reported they had carried out more than 570 separate investigative actions in connection with the case. These investigative actions encompassed a wide range of police work, from formal witness interviews and forensic searches of properties to the analysis of phone records, financial records, and social media activity connected to everyone with any documented relationship to Kieran or his mother during the relevant time period. Gardaí have described the investigation as one of the most complex and resource-intensive cases the force has handled in recent years, requiring coordination across multiple specialized units, including the Garda National Bureau of Criminal Investigation, working alongside local detectives in County Louth. The investigation took another significant turn in May of 2026 when Gardaí arrested a woman in her 50s, described as someone who had known Kyron personally and had been interviewed by detectives on multiple previous occasions throughout the investigation. She became the third person to be arrested in connection with the case, and her arrest came alongside a search of a home in Drogheda. As of the arrest, she remained in custody, being questioned under Ireland's Criminal Justice Act, though, as with the earlier arrests in the case, no formal charges had yet been announced. Ireland's Child and Family Agency, known as TUSLA, which is responsible for child protection services across the country, has acknowledged that it had prior contact with Kieran and his family before his disappearance, and it conducted an internal review of those interactions, submitting its findings to Ireland's National Review Panel, an independent body that examines the deaths of children and serious incidents involving children in the country's care system. This acknowledgement from TUSLA echoes a pattern seen elsewhere in this documentary, a government agency responsible for child welfare having had some prior awareness of a family's circumstances before tragedy struck, followed afterward by an internal review meant to determine whether earlier intervention might have changed the outcome. Irish lawmakers and child welfare advocates have pointed to Kieran's case as a clear signal that stronger cross-agency communication is needed between schools, healthcare providers, and child protection services, so that a child's prolonged and unexplained absence from all of these systems simultaneously can never again go unnoticed for as long as it apparently did in Kieran's case. That review remains ongoing, and its full findings have not yet been made public. As of today, Kieran Durnin's body has never been found, and while multiple people have been arrested and questioned throughout the investigation, nobody has yet been formally charged with his murder. The case has drawn intense coverage across Irish media, in part because of just how unusual its central mystery is. A boy whose absence went completely unnoticed by any formal institution for roughly 2 years. Journalists and child welfare advocates in Ireland have used Kieran's case as a case study in ongoing national conversations about strengthening the country's child protection systems, arguing that a tragedy of this scale demands systemic changes, not just an eventual resolution to the criminal investigation itself. Garda Commissioner Drew Harris described the case as extraordinary, saying that a particular element of it remained, in his words, difficult to comprehend, even for an experienced police officer who had spent 4 decades in the force. Gardaí have said that despite the passage of time since Kieran's presumed death, forensic evidence collected from the searched properties continues to be analyzed using techniques and equipment that have advanced considerably even in the few years since the investigation first began, holding out hope that evidence once considered inconclusive might eventually yield the answers needed to bring formal charges. Investigators continue to ask anyone with even the smallest piece of information about Kieran's life during those 2 hidden years, or about what ultimately happened to him, to come forward in the hope of finally bringing a small boy home to rest. Case 7. Lily and Jack Sullivan. Our next case is different from every other story on this list because it involves not one missing child, but 2. A sister and brother who vanished together from their own rural property in a way that experienced investigators have called almost entirely without precedent. Lily Sullivan, who was 6 years old, and her younger brother Jack, who was 4, lived with their mother, Malahia Brooks Murray, and their stepfather, Daniel Martell, on Gairloch Road in a small rural community called Lansdowne in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, Canada, an area of scattered homes surrounded by dense woodland, roughly 140 kilometers northeast of Halifax. The Lansdowne area, like much of rural Nova Scotia, consists of homes spread far apart along winding country roads, backed by thick forest that stretches for miles in every direction. It is the kind of landscape where children often play freely outdoors, and where a family might not think twice about young children spending time in the yard while a parent works nearby. A normal part of rural life that made the sudden and complete disappearance of 2 children at once all the more shocking to the small community. On the morning of May 2nd, 2025, At approximately 10 o'clock, police received a report that the two children had wandered away from their rural property sometime earlier that morning. The children's mother, Malahia Brooks Murray, made the initial 911 call reporting Lily and Jack missing from the property, telling responding officers that she had last seen them a short time before realizing they could not be found anywhere on the family's land. In the earliest hours of the case, before any wider suspicion had developed, officers treated it as a straightforward search and rescue operation, the kind of case Nova Scotia RCMP officers respond to periodically in rural areas where young children have easy access to surrounding woods and fields. What followed was an enormous search effort. 24 separate ground search and rescue teams, supported by specialized resources from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, known as the RCMP, combed the dense woods, waterways, and open land surrounding the family's home from the ground, from the air, and by water. The scale of the initial search reflected just how seriously Canadian authorities treated the case from its very first hours, mobilizing resources on a level rarely seen even for missing adult cases, let alone a search for two young children. Search teams used everything from trained tracking dogs to sonar equipment on nearby lakes and waterways, working around the clock during the most critical early days when investigators still held the greatest hope of finding the children safe. The RCMP's specialized National Emergency Response Team and search and rescue coordinators from across the maritime provinces converged on Lansdowne within the first day of the search, bringing equipment and expertise not typically available to a small rural detachment on its own. Another clear signal of just how urgently the case was being treated from the very start. Despite 6 full days of searching this heavily wooded terrain, absolutely no sign of either Lily or Jack was found, and on May 7th, RCMP officials announced they were scaling back the active search phase of the investigation. A staff sergeant with the RCMP told reporters plainly at the time that if investigators believed the children were still out there alive in the woods, they would still be actively searching. A stark and difficult statement that signaled just how seriously investigators had already begun to doubt the theory that the two young children had simply wandered off on their own. On May 3rd, just one day after the children were reported missing, the RCMP's Northeast Nova Major Crime Unit took over the investigation. A significant procedural shift that reflected law enforcement's early and serious concern that something more than an ordinary accidental disappearance might have taken place. In the months that followed, investigators pursued more than a dozen search warrants, including a specific and unusual request for surveillance footage from every camera along a tolled highway called the Cobequid Pass. Footage covering vehicles leaving Nova Scotia in the roughly 36-hour window surrounding the children's disappearance, suggesting investigators were actively considering the possibility that the children, or whoever might have been responsible for their disappearance, had left the province entirely. Court documents released later in the investigation also revealed that, on May 3rd, just one day into the case, police received an unverified tip suggesting the children might be with their biological father, a report that came from an unnamed caller who acknowledged they had no actual proof but wanted to make sure investigators considered every possibility. This detail, along with the toll booth footage request, illustrates just how wide a net investigators cast in the earliest days of the case, chasing down every conceivable lead, no matter how tenuous, in the hope of finding the two children before it was too late. As the investigation continued, court documents that were later unsealed and made public revealed further troubling details about the family's home life in the months leading up to the disappearance. According to these documents, Malahia Brooks Murray had accused her partner, Daniel Martel, of being physically abusive toward her on multiple occasions before the children vanished. Martel has firmly denied these allegations, telling reporters that he believed the narrative was being used to unfairly paint him as guilty, and insisting that he had never physically abused Malahia. The documents also revealed that both parents were given polygraph examinations early in the investigation, with police recording their own initial impressions of how each parent responded during that testing, though the specific results of those polygraphs have not been made fully public. Investigators also confirmed they had found a second piece of a pink blanket during their search of the property, a detail that has never been fully explained publicly but that remains part of the broader physical evidence collected during the case. A leading child protection expert in Canada, Nick Oldreive, who runs a volunteer search organization called Please Bring Me Home, has said publicly that this case is almost entirely without precedent in his experience, explaining that in a country where the vast majority of missing children are located within days, the idea of two small children disappearing together at the same time, in a way investigators still cannot explain more than a year later, is what he describes as profoundly rare. Nova Scotia's own top RCMP Criminal Operations Officer, Chief Superintendent Dan Morrow, echoed this sentiment in an interview marking the case's one-year anniversary, saying he had never seen anything quite like it across his entire career in law enforcement. Canada's National Centre for Missing Persons and Unidentified Remains, along with the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, both stepped in to assist the RCMP with specialized resources rarely deployed for a single case, reflecting the scale of concern this particular disappearance generated at a national level. These organizations typically provide forensic expertise, database matching capabilities, and coordination support that individual provincial police forces may not have readily available on their own, resources that became essential given just how unusual and resistant to explanation this particular case has proven to be. By early 2026, months into the investigation, RCMP officials confirmed they had received well over 1,000 tips from the public and had generated more than 1,400 separate investigative tasks as they worked to piece together what had truly happened to Lily and Jack. Investigators identified 35 separate individuals for formal interviews in the earliest stages of the case, including community members and those closest to the children, a scope of interviewing that reflects just how seriously and broadly the RCMP has approached the case from the very beginning. Officers have said publicly that they have not ruled out that the case is suspicious, language that in a missing persons investigation signals investigators believe foul play may well be involved, even without enough evidence yet to make an arrest. Lily and Jack were described by family members as extremely close siblings, with Lily, the elder of the two, often looking after her younger brother in the way 6-year-olds sometimes take on a caretaking role with a younger sibling. Photographs shared publicly by the family showed two happy, healthy children, and relatives have said repeatedly that neither child had any history of wandering off or leaving the property unsupervised before, which is part of what made the RCMP's early skepticism about a simple wandering explanation so significant to how the case was handled from the very beginning. The province of Nova Scotia eventually offered a reward of up to $150,000 for information leading to answers in the case, one of the largest rewards ever offered in a Canadian missing persons investigation. A reward of this size, offered directly by a provincial government rather than through a private fund or family donations, signals just how seriously Nova Scotia's government came to view the case as the months passed without resolution. Rewards of this scale are typically reserved for major unsolved crimes where investigators believe someone in the public may hold a critical piece of information they have not yet come forward with, whether out of fear, uncertainty about its relevance, or a simple failure to realize how important a small detail might be to solving the case. The children's maternal grandmother, Cindy Murray, has spoken publicly and often about the toll the ongoing uncertainty has taken on the entire family, saying that going an entire year without any answers has been almost impossible to put into words, describing the experience as mentally and emotionally exhausting for everyone who loves the children. Malahia Brooks Murray and Daniel Martel have both continued to live in Nova Scotia throughout the investigation, cooperating with police even as public suspicion, fueled in part by the unsealed court documents and the allegations of domestic abuse within their relationship, has continued to swirl around them. Neither parent has been named a formal suspect or arrested at any point during the investigation, and both have continued to publicly express their hope that Lily and Jack will one day be found. The RCMP has cautioned the public repeatedly against drawing premature conclusions based on partial information released through the media, stressing that the full picture of the investigation remains far more complex than any single detail released publicly can convey. Even as official search efforts scaled back in the earliest days of the investigation, volunteers have refused to give up. In April of 2026, nearly a full year after the children disappeared, roughly 40 volunteers, including loved ones of Lily and Jack themselves, organized through the Please Bring Me Home organization, returned once again to the woods around Lansdowne to continue searching for any clue that might still be out there. During that search, volunteers discovered a new, child-sized boot print, a small but significant find that renewed hope, even though it has not yet led to any further breakthrough in locating the children. Volunteer-led searches like this one have become an increasingly important part of how families and communities respond to long unsolved missing child cases, particularly once official search operations wind down to a smaller, more targeted scale focused on following up specific leads rather than combing broad stretches of terrain. Organizations like Please Bring Me Home specialize in coordinating these kinds of grassroots efforts, bringing trained volunteers, search equipment, and organizational structure to searches that might otherwise consist of well-meaning but disorganized groups of concerned community members, helping ensure that any potential evidence found is properly documented and reported to the RCMP, rather than accidentally disturbed or overlooked. As of today, the RCMP continues to describe its investigation into the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan as active and comprehensive, working alongside Canada's National Centre for Missing Persons and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. Investigators have said their team remains fully committed to establishing exactly what happened to the two children, pursuing every single lead and applying every resource available to them. On Canada's National Missing Persons Day, observed annually to draw attention to unresolved cases across the country, the RCMP specifically highlighted Lily and Jack's case as an example of an investigation that remains every bit as active today as it was on its very first day, a message intended both to reassure the family and to remind the public that new tips, however small they might seem, could still make all the difference in finally solving the case. As of now, no one has been arrested, no charges have been filed, and Lily and Jack Sullivan, ages 6 and 4, when they vanished from their own front yard on an ordinary spring morning, remain missing, in a case that has left even the most experienced investigators in the country searching for an explanation they have never encountered before. Case 8. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton. Our final case is unlike any other on this list because it involves not one, not two, but 3 brothers who vanished together from their own father's home in the small town of Morenci, Michigan, on Thanksgiving weekend of 2010, in a case that would take 15 years to move from a lesser conviction all the way to murder charges. Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton were 9, 7, and 5 years old at the time. Their parents, John Skelton and Tanya Zuvers, were going through a difficult divorce and custody dispute, and the boys had gone to spend the Thanksgiving holiday with their father, John, at his home in Morenci, a small town near the Michigan and Ohio border. Morenci is a tiny farming community sitting almost directly on the state line, the kind of small town where most families know each other and where a case like this one would leave a mark on the community for generations. The three Skelton boys were, by all accounts from family and neighbors, close brothers who did everything together, with the two older boys looking out for their younger brother Tanner in the way older siblings often do. Their disappearance during a holiday weekend meant for family gatherings would make the case all the more painful for a small town that had watched all three boys grow up together. Under the custody arrangement in place at the time, John was supposed to return the boys to their mother on the day after Thanksgiving, a day widely known as Black Friday, November 26th. That handoff never happened. When Tanya stopped hearing from John and grew concerned, she went to his house to check on the boys herself. John was not home. Investigators later learned he was at a hospital, having broken his ankle, and according to hospital staff, he told them at the time that the injury had happened while he was attempting to take his own life. When police were eventually able to get inside John's home, what they found was disturbing. The house had been torn apart, with broken glass scattered around, appliance cords that had been cut or severed, and, perhaps most chilling of all, a noose hanging from the home's second floor. Investigators also found a Bible left open in the house, with a specific verse circled inside it. The scene inside the Skelton home immediately signaled to investigators that something far more serious than a simple custody dispute gone wrong had taken place there. The level of destruction throughout the house, combined with the disturbing symbolism of the noose and the marked Bible passage, led investigators to treat the case with extreme urgency from the very first hours, even before John Skelton had given his first, ultimately false, account of where his sons had gone. But nowhere in the house were the three boys. John Skelton's account of what had happened to his sons shifted dramatically and repeatedly in the days that followed. At first, he told investigators the boys were staying with a family friend, a woman he identified as Joanne Taylor. When police tried to locate this woman to confirm his story, they discovered that no such person actually existed. Confronted with this, John changed his story entirely, this time claiming that he had handed his three sons over to members of an underground organization. An unnamed and unidentified group, he said, had taken the boys in order to protect them from their mother. He was never able to provide any evidence supporting the existence of this organization, and this explanation, like the one before it, could never be substantiated by investigators in any way. This progression, from a fabricated individual to a fabricated organization, each story crumbling under even basic investigative scrutiny, became one of the most damning aspects of the entire case in the court of public opinion. Even though it would take 15 years for prosecutors to bring the murder charges that many observers felt were justified from the very beginning, legal experts who have followed the case over the years have noted that building a murder case without a body, and without any witnesses beyond the accused himself, requires an extraordinarily high standard of circumstantial evidence, which likely explains why Michigan prosecutors moved cautiously for so long before finally filing charges just before Skelton's scheduled release. Police also determined that John had driven his blue Dodge Caravan on the Thursday or Friday of that Thanksgiving weekend along the Ohio Turnpike, crossing the nearby state border into Ohio before eventually returning to Morenci. This detail, the tracked movement of Skelton's vehicle across state lines during the exact window when his sons vanished, became one of the most significant pieces of circumstantial evidence investigators would hold on to for the next decade and a half, even as they lacked enough additional evidence to bring more serious charges at the time. It suggested a deliberate, planned trip rather than any kind of spontaneous or accidental event, and it would remain a central thread connecting the original 2010 investigation to the murder charges eventually filed against him 15 years later. In the days and weeks that followed, the small border community between Michigan and Ohio came together for an intensive search, with volunteers and investigators combing fields, farms, and wooded areas along the state line, hoping to find some trace of the three brothers. Despite this extensive search effort, nothing was ever found. Because the case involved a father allegedly transporting his children across state lines, the FBI became involved early on, joining Michigan State Police and local Lenawee County authorities in the investigation. The involvement of federal investigators reflected the seriousness with which authorities treated the case from its earliest days, even before the full scope of what had likely happened to the three boys became clear. Search efforts in Ohio focused particularly on rural farmland and wooded areas along routes Skelton was known to have traveled, though, like the searches conducted on the Michigan side of the border, these efforts ultimately produced no physical evidence connecting to the boys' whereabouts. On November 30th, 2010, just days after the boys were reported missing, John Skelton was arrested and charged with kidnapping his own sons. He ultimately entered a plea of no contest, meaning he did not admit guilt but chose not to contest the charges, to 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment, and in 2011 he was sentenced to serve between 10 and 15 years in prison. Throughout the entirety of his time behind bars, John became eligible for parole on several separate occasions, and each and every time, the Michigan Parole Board denied his release, with the board eventually voting to permanently deny him parole altogether, keeping him incarcerated all the way through the maximum length of his original sentence. For nearly 15 years, this kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment conviction remained the only charge John Skelton had ever faced in connection with his son's disappearance, even though investigators and much of the public had long suspected something far more serious. In June of 2024, Tanya Zuvers, the boy's mother, took the difficult legal step of filing to have her 3 sons formally declared legally dead, seeking a measure of closure after so many years without any answers. During that legal proceeding, Zuvers told the court directly that their father had shown the boys no respect at all. In March of 2025, a judge in Lenawee County formally declared Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner legally dead, though the same judge stopped short of making any formal finding that their father had murdered them, stating at the time that doing so, without more concrete evidence, would only be joining in on public speculation and theory rather than reaching a legally sound conclusion. A legal declaration of death, separate and distinct from a criminal murder conviction, allows a family to resolve certain practical and legal matters, estate issues, insurance questions, and simply having an official government record reflecting what most people involved in the case already believe to be true without requiring the same burden of proof a criminal court demands. For Tanya Zuvers, obtaining this declaration after nearly 14 years of uncertainty represented one form of closure. Even as the deeper question of criminal accountability for her son's deaths remained entirely unresolved at the time, a gap that would not begin to close until the murder charges filed against John Skelton just months later. Throughout the years John Skelton spent in prison, Tanya Zuvers became a persistent public advocate for her sons, giving interviews on the anniversary of their disappearance, working with law enforcement, and refusing to let the case fade from public memory even during long stretches when no new developments emerged. Her decision to pursue a legal declaration of death for her 3 sons in 2024, rather than continuing to wait indefinitely for a criminal resolution that had not come in over a decade, reflected a painful but practical choice many families in long unsolved cases eventually face, seeking at least one form of legal closure even without the deeper answers a criminal conviction might someday provide. Everything changed in November of 2025. Just days before John Skelton was scheduled to be released from prison after completing his full sentence for unlawful imprisonment, Michigan State Police and prosecutors in Lenawee County filed 3 counts of open murder and 3 counts of tampering with evidence against him, 1 count for each of his 3 sons. An FBI agent involved in the case testified that investigators considered a note John had left behind for Tanya at the time of the boy's disappearance. A note that read, in part, "You will hate me forever, and I know this," to be what the agent directly described in court as Skelton's own passive admission to killing his children. Investigators also stated that despite years of searching, they had never been able to find any credible proof that the three boys were still alive anywhere. The additional tampering with evidence charges filed alongside the murder count suggests that prosecutors believe Skelton took deliberate steps to conceal or destroy evidence related to what happened to his sons, beyond simply failing to report where they had gone. Michigan's open murder charge is a distinctive feature of the state's legal system, allowing prosecutors to bring a case forward without initially specifying whether they will pursue a first-degree or second-degree murder conviction, giving them flexibility to make that determination as the case against Skelton continues to develop through the pretrial process. Legal observers following the case have noted that a trial built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence gathered nearly 15 years after the fact will present significant challenges for prosecutors, from locating and preparing witnesses whose memories have faded over a decade and a half, to ensuring physical evidence collected back in 2010 has been properly preserved and remains admissible in court today. Despite these challenges, the Lenawee County Prosecutor's Office has expressed confidence in the strength of the case, pointing to the consistency of the physical evidence gathered at the scene in 2010. With the far more detailed picture, investigators have since been able to piece together using modern investigative techniques unavailable to them at the time. Whatever the outcome of the eventual trial, the filing of murder charges alone has already changed the way this case will be remembered, transforming it from a story about a father convicted only of unlawful imprisonment into one where he now stands formally accused of taking his own three sons' lives, a distinction that matters enormously both legally and to the family that has waited 15 years to see it happen. John Skelton's bond was set at an extraordinary $60 million following the murder charges, and as of early 2026, his case remains pending, with a preliminary hearing pushed back to May of that year. Due to the sheer volume of evidence and information investigators have gathered over the nearly 15 years since the boys disappeared. In a statement issued through representatives after the murder charges were filed, Tanya Zuvers called the development a significant moment in what she described as a long and painful journey, expressing gratitude to the law enforcement officers and prosecutors who had continued working the case for so many years, while asking that her family's privacy be respected as they processed the news and continued grieving the loss of Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner. The case has left a lasting mark on the small community of Morenci, a town that has watched the story unfold in the local and national press for a decade and a half. From the initial frantic search in the freezing days after Thanksgiving, through John Skelton's original conviction, and now into the murder trial still to come. A documentary examining the full story of the missing Skelton brothers has also been produced, helping keep the case in public view even during the many quiet years when no new developments emerged. Local residents who took part in the original search back in 2010 have said in more recent interviews that they still think about that Thanksgiving weekend often, and that the eventual filing of murder charges brought back a flood of memories from a case that had shaped their small community for a generation. As of today, the three Skelton brothers have never been found, despite repeated searches across both Michigan and Ohio spanning nearly a decade and a half. Their father now faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison if convicted of murdering them, closing in, after 15 long years, on the kind of formal accountability that so many of the cases in this documentary have never managed to reach at all. Thank you for taking the time to learn these 8 stories, and to hold these 10 children in your thoughts, even for just the length of this documentary. They deserved far more than what happened to them, and the very least we can offer now is to remember them, to say their names, and to keep watching for the day their questions might finally be answered. If you have any information about any of the cases discussed here, no matter how small it might seem, we encourage you to contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, your local police department, or for the international cases discussed here, the appropriate national police force. Sometimes, the smallest piece of information is the one piece that finally brings a family the answers they have been waiting years or even decades to hear.